Welcome to Abide in Liberty, a podcast empowering patriots everywhere to re-enthrone faith, family, and freedom as the bedrock pillars of liberty in education, our communities, and our nation.
Welcome back, everybody, for another episode of Abide in Liberty. Thank you for being here. Today, we're going to wrap up our review of the principles of freedom that our founding fathers almost universally agreed to, as outlined in the 5,000-Year Leap by Clean Skousen. Without further ado, let's just jump in to these final few principles. The first one that we're going to talk about today is the principle of avoiding entangling alliances. So this is kind of similar. The founding fathers believed to a philosophy as it relates to how we interact with the rest of the world that was very similar to the position of neutrality that Switzerland takes today. That is, that they will interact with any nation on the planet commercially, but when it comes to political entanglements and political alliances, they're gonna be Switzerland, right? They're gonna be neutral and stay out of all that mess. Most of the quotes that we're going to talk about today come from George Washington, because right off the bat, at the beginning of his presidency, he was faced with this very issue. So right about the time that the Constitution was ratified and we held our first election where George Washington became the first president of the United States, France was in the middle of spiraling out of control into the horrors of the French Revolution. And at some point and throughout George Washington's presidency and beyond, the French wanted the Americans to step in and help them in their revolution. And there were many pockets within American society that wanted us to do that. So number one of the main reasons for that is that the French, now this was the French nobility, but the French came to our aid during our revolution. They supplied money and loans. They supplied toward the latter part of the war, they joined in an official alliance where they brought ships over and soldiers. Before this point, we had no access to any kind of a navy. And so through the French, we got access to a navy and were able to control the seas better than we could have in any other way. So a lot of people wanted to reciprocate and pay them back for that. Now, there were a couple problems with that. George Washington saw the writing on the wall and could tell that this was different from what was going on here in America. And number two, he also knew we weren't really in a position to help in the first place. So he kind of saw the role that we should take as being, look, we got to get our feet under us first. I mean, one of the main reasons why the Constitutional Convention was called was because we were in so much pain economically and we were on the verge of collapse that it was do or die. We had to fix things or the United States of America was going to cease to exist. England would pounce back in, Spain would come in, someone was going to come in and take over if we didn't get our act together. So we weren't exactly in a position to be helping in the first place, but this led to George Washington in particular adopting a stance of neutrality, of we will trade with anybody. We will be your trading partners. We will sell you goods. We will buy your goods, but we're not going to come help you fight your wars. He also said, a passionate attachment of one nation for another facilitates the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists. Now, this was the philosophy of the United States for a very long time, and World War I is a good example of what happens when you have alliances, political alliances with other countries, and how those alliances can drag you down into problems and into conflicts that you really have no business being a part of. So during leading up to World War I, the nations of Europe all had kind of this complex, insanely confusing web of alliances where one country had alliances with these three countries, and one of those anyways, it was completely just a tangled mess. And what happened was you had two countries that started going after it, and because country A was fighting country B, but then you've got a whole bunch of countries that were, or a couple countries that were allied with country A, they came in and joined the fight. And others were allied with country B and they were pulled into it. Well, then those allies of country A and B also had alliances with other countries outside of that. And so they then were pulled into this conflict. And so because there was this chain reaction of alliances, you ended up with a world war where basically the entire European continent was drug into this conflict that started off as a spat between two small countries, but everyone else got drug into it because of these alliances. Now, this occurred after the founding of our country, but that was the exact type of thing that the founding fathers were trying to avoid in their position of neutrality. George Washington also said the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So kind of going back to what I was saying before, let's buy and sell with anybody, but we're not going to have special friends when it comes to politics. And this is something that actually George Washington got some heat for, the fact that he wouldn't come out and openly support France. And France and its ambassadors were a little bit ticked off by this too. For a time, they threatened to stop trading. I mean, this was just such a foreign concept to Europe, which lived and breathed by these alliances and these feuds, and you teaming up with this other group to come over and attack England. This was just kind of the way that politics worked. And the fact that America was now trying to take this neutral position really irked both France and England. And it took Europe a while to get used to the idea that that was the way that America was going to play. All right, next principle is the importance of protecting the role of the family. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his famous visit to the Americas to see what made America so unique among nations, said, "There is certainly no country in the world where the tie of marriage is more respected than in America, or where conjugal happiness is more highly or worthily appreciated. In Europe, almost all the disturbances of society arise from the irregularities of domestic life." Let me read that again. In Europe, almost all the disturbances of society arise from the irregularities of domestic life. That is a true principle. The irregularities and the disturbances in our society arise from problems in the home and from weakened and undermined families. To despise the natural bonds and legitimate pleasure of home is to contract a taste for excesses, a restlessness of heart, and fluctuating desires. Agitated by the tumultuous passions that frequently disturb his dwelling, the European is galled by the obedience which the legislative powers of the state exact. But when the American retires from the turmoil of public life to the bosom of his family, he finds in it the image of order and of peace. There his pleasures are simple and natural, his joys are innocent and calm, and he finds that an orderly life is the surest path to happiness. He accustoms himself easily to moderate his opinions as well as his tastes. While the European endeavors to forget his domestic troubles by agitating society, so again, while the European endeavors to forget his domestic troubles by agitating society, the American derives from his own home that love of order which he afterwards carries with him into public affairs. So he's kind of describing secularly what we know spiritually to be true, that the fundamental unit of society is the family as prescribed in God's law. And that's a man and a woman joined legally and lawfully as husband and wife who undertake to rear a family in righteousness. Now that's the ideal. And I get, in my family, I get that The ideal isn't always possible, but that's what we should be striving for. Family as that fundamental unit of society. This is where rearing and educating children to be good citizens, to be good, virtuous, moral people, this is where that happens. And without the stability of that family life, I mean, first of all, if families stopped being a thing, and if family stops being the method for which procreation occurs, it's hard to perpetuate society without children, number one. And China is facing the consequences of the family limiting policies that they had imposed on their people. The impact of that is hitting them square in the face now with not enough people to replace the population and take care of the older generation. But not only that, but when the family is undermined and where families are broken, it leaves broken people behind it. And it is really hard to have a peaceful, prosperous society that is made up by broken hearts, dashed dreams, people with trust that has been completely violated, and where they don't have the stability of a mother and a father that love them, that help them through the difficult times of life, and that teach them how to be good parents in turn and good citizens in society. Family is everything to a free society, and any attempt to attack and undermine the traditional family is an attack on freedom itself. Full stop. Here's another fun principle that is a little bit depressing to talk about today, and that's the importance of avoiding the burden of debt. Thomas Jefferson said, "The maxim of buying nothing without the money in our pockets to pay for it would make our country one of the happiest on earth." And indeed, during the period of its history when it did pay its debts and wasn't passing on massive debt from one generation to another, this was the most happy and prosperous society that the world has ever known. And there's a lot of things that contributed to that, and this is one of them. And it's not a small contributing factor. The Bible tells us to avoid debt like the plague, and that the borrower is slave of the lender. And that is as true of countries as it is of nations. Benjamin Franklin said, "Think what you do when you run in debt. You give to another power over your liberty." And when we as a country take on excessive debt, we are giving to somebody else or to another nation, as the case may be, power over our liberty, over our sovereignty. And that's a scary thought. Thomas Jefferson said, "I place economy or thrift or being responsible with money among the first and most important of Republican virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared." He went on to say, "We are bound to defray the war's expenses within our own time and unauthorized to burden posterity with them." So in talking about the debt that the country had incurred during war, he was talking about how important it was for that generation to pay off that debt, that it is immoral. And I didn't read the whole quote, but he goes on to talk about how immoral it is to think that we can incur a debt today and expect our children and our grandchildren to pay it on our behalf. We don't do that with estate planning today. If I die and I have a car loan outstanding, it doesn't throw my son, my 14-year-old son, into debtor's prison, or it doesn't tank his credit because that debt has passed along to him. But for some reason, the national debt, which is greater than any mortgage loan or any car loan, that's okay to pass along. That's okay for us to pass from one generation to another. I don't think so. Now, a look at the history of natural debt is a pretty sad one. And up through World War II, we did a pretty good job of, if we did have to incur debt to fight a war or to face some sort of an emergency, of paying it off relatively quickly. But after World War II, things really started to get out of control. Today, our national debt is about $31 trillion. So our country owes $31 trillion in debt. our GDP, gross domestic product, is $23 trillion. So the gross domestic product is the value of everything that this country produces in 1 year. So if somehow we could take the value of everything that we produce and chunk that at the debt, which means nobody's buying any food, nobody is buying any clothing, nobody is getting anything at all, but we could somehow make everything in a year, not have to consume it or buy it ourselves, and we could get someone else to buy that for us. Even that wouldn't wipe out the debt. We'd still have almost $10 trillion left over. That is a massive amount of money that simply cannot be paid off in our lifetime. So we are living in an immoral state where we are burdening our posterity if we continue doing what we're doing with the consequences of our own poor spending decisions. And just to kind of put this in perspective, the interest alone on the debt, on that $31 trillion of debt, is about $400 billion per year. Now, the total government budget in 1960 was under $100 billion. So a mere 50 years later, we are paying about 4 times the amount of the entire government budget from the 1960s in interest alone. That is a massive burden, and that is a massive amount of debt that someday, sooner or later, we're going to pay the consequences of. You cannot keep piling on that type of debt forever without it all coming crashing down. The real question is, are we going to do something about it before that happens? Or are we going to wait for it to be so painful that we don't have a choice? I hope we're smart enough to react proactively to solve the problem. All right, now the final principle of the 5,000-year leap, and that I want to talk about, is the principle of manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny can get a bad rap. This was a principle that a lot of people used to justify expanding our country, or even, manifest destiny was kind of what led the United States to foment a revolution in Panama so that it could gain control of Panama and complete the Panama Canal and allow greater and less expensive passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So manifest destiny has been used in some inappropriate ways, but the way the founding fathers saw the role of America was as a city on a hill. Historian John Fiske said, they believed that they were doing a wonderful thing. They felt themselves to be instruments in accomplishing a kind of manifest destiny. Their exodus was that of a chosen people. So their exodus, they're leaving the old country, leaving Europe, was that of a chosen people who were at length to lay the everlasting foundations of God's kingdom upon earth. This steadfast faith in an unseen ruler and guide was to them a pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night. It was of great moral value. It gave them clearness of purpose and concentration of strength, and contributed towards making them like the children of Israel. John Adams said, I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder as the opening of a grand scene and design and providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth. We do have a responsibility to protect and preserve the freedoms that we have and enjoy here and now, so that we can help that freedom to spread throughout the world. When Christ came and taught the liberating principles of Christianity, the very first thing he started to do was to send his disciples into the world to preach and to teach and to act as missionaries. And our country has that same responsibility. There are people in this world and throughout the world that are oppressed, that don't enjoy the freedom and the liberty that we do. And we do have a responsibility to be missionaries of freedom and to spread that freedom to as many people as possible. And that That's one of the great things that we look forward to in the millennium is peace and freedom and prosperity for everybody. And we get the opportunity to practice that now and to do everything that we can to preserve it and to spread it. My prayer is that we can pull off the preserving it part. And I can't wait to see what this world looks like as that freedom spreads throughout. That reign of peace when Christ returns and that reign of freedom is worth working for now and looking forward to in the future.
Thank you for listening to Abide in Liberty. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes and share this with friends and family. In the meantime, keep up with the show online at abideinliberty.com. Also, if you'd like to help our K-12 bless and educate more families, contact us by visiting libertyyouthacademy.org. Until next time, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, and be strong.